Alright, so here we are. Very last video for the Talented Ball character. In this video, what we need to do is get this guy converted over into a digital asset in case in the future we ever want to reuse our character with ease. And in doing such, this time around we're going to demonstrate creating the digital asset as an object level digital asset instead of a geometry level digital asset. And the reason is we're not looking for an artist to jump into the geometry container and transform the object from the SOPs level. That doesn't make a lot of sense. When an artist is animating something in a scene, it's generally done at the object level with the geometry itself.
Exactly.
So with the object. So it makes sense for us to convert this guy into a digital asset that is an object as opposed to low-level geometry. So we're going to take a look at that. Then we're going to promote some parameters up, and we're going to add some sliders in, and we're going to talk about persistent handles and good stuff like that.
Cool.
So a few different things, but by the time we get done with this video, we will have a completed character with his own custom shader, and that character will be set up in such a way that he has an interface for ease of control.
Awesome.
All right, Steve, so take it away.
So I'm going to jump up to object level by pushing U, and we can see we've got our character geometry object. We're going to turn this geometry object into our asset, and that's nice and easy. We simply right-click on our character geometry object and come down to create digital asset. And we see the same pop-up that we've seen many times before. So I want to call this guy character with the label of character with a capital C. We don't need inputs, and I want to save this into a custom OTL. So here's our OTLs folder. I'm going to save this into character.otl. Again, just installing to the current HIP file. If we click accept, we're going to get an error message pop up. Well, it's more of a warning than an error. And basically, it's telling us about parameters that are going to have to be modified and the likes. We can simply tell it to destroy all spare parameters. We don't need those spare parameters for our asset, and that will clear up that error and sort out that issue for us. So we can see that because we've converted our geometry object into an asset, we get all the parameters that come along with the geometry object for the ride, and we really don't want these necessarily on our assets. So what I'm going to do, because I don't want to just delete them.
Well, we can't really just delete them.
We can't delete the ones that are 100% necessary for an object. I'm just going to make them invisible.
Nice.
So that means they're there, but the animator doesn't have to worry about them. So I'm selecting each of these folders in turn and checking the invisible tab. And by doing that, it's also going to hide out any of the parameters that exist up under that folder. So I'm going to set the material folder to invisible, the render folder to invisible, the miscellaneous folder to invisible, and this renderable checkbox to invisible. And if I click apply, we can now see when we select our character, we have no parameters available. So that's fantastic. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to drag out my own folder and use this folder for creating our parameters. So I drag out a folder. I'm going to rename this folder to character. And first off, I want to grab our translation and our rotation and our pivot from the object, since we may need to use these for the animation that we're doing. We want to translate our character. If we want to rotate our character other than that special rotate, we may well need to use rotation and the pivot point as well. And I'm going to grab these, and I'm going to single click drag with the left mouse down over to our folder and place those into the folder. So now if we click apply, we have the translation, rotation and pivot parameters available. And if we were to translate, this is going to work as if it was the translation before. All we've done is change the folder the parameters in. The parameter is the exact same parameter as before. So there, the basic transformation parameters I'm going to promote up. I also want to promote up some of the shading parameters from our shader. So I'm going to create a new folder underneath character by single clicking and dragging on folder over to our character. And I'm going to rename this folder to shader. And then I'm going to come over to from nodes and jump into our character shop, into our M character, and into our VOP surface 1. And I want to grab our texture, and I want to grab the texture map, which is going to be where we specify the image that we want to use for our character. I want to also make sure that we're not prefixing our name or our label before I promote this up. And I'm going to promote up our texture map, which I'll rename to diffuse map. I also want to set some of the specular parameters. So let's grab our specular intensity, specular color, and U roughness. Promote those over. I will rename U roughness to specular roughness, because that makes more sense in terms of that parameter as an artist level control as opposed to the technical down under the hood. And I'll also grab the ambient color from the ambient FOP up underneath our shader and promote that over as well. So with those in place, I'm going to click accept, and we're going to see that we've got our shader tab with some shader related parameters, and we've got the basic transformation parameters. Now we now have our squash and stretch, our bend, and our special rotate to deal with, and we're going to create those as sliders. So to do that, I'm going to jump down inside our character asset, and you'll see we jump down inside the character asset, our network is still there as before. And I'm first going to grab the rotate Z of our special rotate transform, because we want him to be a slider. And creating a slider from a parameter is really easy. We can simply click on the parameter. In this case, I'm going to grab all of the rotate, single click, drag over to our viewer, and release the left mouse button. And it'll ask us, what do we want to do with this? We want to create a HUD slider. And that HUD slider is going to give us our rotate X, our rotate Y, and our rotate Z because we clicked on rotate, which is fantastic because now I can introduce the persistent handle editor. So I'm going to come up to Windows and down to the persistent handle editor. And let's just make this slightly larger so that we can see we've got three handles here: rotate X, rotate Y, and rotate Z. We don't want rotate X, so we can delete him by clicking on the little red X. We don't want rotate Y, so we can delete him by clicking on the little red X. If we click apply, we now only have the one rotate Z slider. Also, the name of our rotate Z slider currently is HUD slider : and then basically an absolute path to that parameter, and that's kind of messy. So let's grab the name from up here, HUD slider : delete that out, and replace this with special rotate, and click apply. So now the name of our slider is special rotate, so that's much cleaner. So I'm going to accept that. So that's a special rotate slider, and currently it's just in our viewport and it's relating to this node. It's not yet on our asset, but I'm going to create the squash and stretch and the bend sliders first, before then promoting all of these sliders up to our asset. So let's grab the bend, and let's grab the strength parameter from the bend, and I'm going to single click and drag that out. And that's going to create the strength parameter for the bend, and let's bring up our persistent handle editor. And I'm going to rename this to bend. And I will just minimize this for now because I'm going to need to grab him in a second. And let's come to our squash and stretch twist SOP. Grab the strength parameter from him and drag him out. And now we've got a slider for our squash and stretch as well. I'll bring back up the persistent handle editor and rename this to squash and stretch. So now we've got three sliders that if we were to change the values on the slider, we're going to change. That's extreme.
Yeah, just a little bit.
Let's right click, revert to defaults. There we go. And right click, revert to defaults. Both times revert to was off the bottom of the screen there. But now we've got special rotate. That's why it's extreme, because I got that node selected. There we go. So I'm seeing both of them. So we've got our special rotate. We have control over bending. And right now these slider values are crazy. When we promote it to our asset, we're going to change the ranges of these sliders so that everything makes much more sense. And we have squash and stretch as well. So we can see we do have control with the sliders, but right now their ranges are extreme. So with that in place, we can now export these as if we were exporting parameters to our digital asset. We can export handles to our digital asset. To do that, I'm going to bring up the type properties for our character asset. So I'm going to right click on the character, and I'm going to bring up type properties, that is off the bottom of the capture region. And with this open, I can right click on each of these handles in turn, and I can choose from the pop-up menu, export handle to digital asset. This is going to do a couple of things. When we click this, we get a new parameter created. It creates a parameter up on the type properties of our asset. It then links this parameter to the parameter that we originally created the slider from. So in this case, this parameter is now linked to rotate Z on our special rotate transform. And it's going to create a special rotate handle, which in this case, this handle is a slider. So we created a slider at asset level. We've created a parameter that's controlled by that slider at asset level. And then we've linked up our actual parameter that we really wanted to be controlled to reference this newly created parameter. So we've got this newly created parameter. Let's set its range to -360 to 360 for our rotate. That's not going to set the range of the slider, it's going to set the range of the parameter. When we select our asset, we'll see that parameter like any other parameter, and that will set the slider range for it. So that's rotate Z. Let's also promote up our bend. So I'm going to right click and come to export handle to digital asset. And that's exported the parameter name of strength. So I'm going to rename this to bend, and again the label of bend. And when we come back to rotate Z, I'm going to rename this to special rotate. And on our bend, for the actual parameter slider as opposed to the HUD slider, I'm going to give this a range of -30 to 30. And then finally I'm going to right click on our squash and stretch, come down to export handle to digital asset, rename this to squash and stretch, squash and stretch, and give this a range of -2 to 2. So if we now click, well, if we come over to handles, we'll see we've got our 3 handles. If we now click accept, what's going to happen, currently we're still seeing the temporary handles. These are the handles that we clicked and dragged over into our view. But if we jump up, and with our assets selected, and we can already see that we've now got both sets. So let's come over to our persistent handle editor and get rid of the old ones. We're only seeing the 3 sliders we created as persistent handles, and we can delete those out. If we select our character, we can now see the handles that appear with our character asset. If we were to lose those handles, with our character selected and the mouse over the view, push the enter key, and that will bring those sliders back up. So we've got our 3 sliders for our squash and stretch, our bend, and our special rotate. Now let's bring up the type properties for our asset. So I right clicked on our asset and I'm coming down to type properties, that's off the bottom of the capture region. We can now set some of the ranges for the sliders themselves. I'll just minimize this just to prove my point. We've created these 3 parameters. Their sliders have the ranges that we set up over in the type properties. These sliders still don't. This still goes down to about 0 and up to around 360. It hasn't taken these ranges from these sliders, and that's because they have their own parameters that control their ranges. So over on the handles tab of the type properties, I've come down to special rotate, and I'm going to change just a couple of these parameter settings. So I'm going to scroll through. The first one I'm going to change is HUD locked. Currently our slider is an unlocked slider, and what that means is we could click and drag on the just around the edge of the slider and move it in our view, and we don't want that. We want it to be locked in position, because if an artist comes in and he wants to click drag on a slider, we don't want him to maybe accidentally move the slider. That would be very frustrating. So we can change this to a value of 1, a value of true, and this HUD slider is now going to be locked. We also have the ability to set the HUD range high and the HUD range low, and this is the exact same type thing as when we set parameters ranges high and low. A high of 360, that's great, but a low of 0, I want a low of 360, and that's going to now give us a range of 360 at the top, minus 360 at the bottom. But because HUD lock high and HUD lock low are set to 0, we can go outside of those if we wish to. So let's apply that. You notice that we now can go to minus 360 and positive 360, and you'll also notice that we don't have the white box around our special rotate because it's a locked slider. So now let's grab our bend slider and let's do a similar thing. So let's go over to HUD locked, set that to 1. Come over to HUD range high, and I want this to be 30, and our HUD range low to be negative 30. So I'm basically matching the same values that I used over when we set up our sliders, and apply. And then let's grab our squash and stretch. So a HUD locked of 1, HUD range high of 2, and a HUD range low of negative 2. And with that we can click accept. We have our 3 sliders. Our squash and stretch goes from 2 to negative 2. Our bend goes from negative 30 to positive 30, and we also have our rotation. If we right click on each of these sliders in turn and come down to revert to and choose defaults, The default values at the moment are crazy. So let's bring up our type properties and change the default values. I believe that would be over here on the parameters tab. For each of these parameters, the default values for the parameter control the default values for the slider. So once again, I right clicked on our asset, brought up the type properties. I came over to the parameters tab. I hunted down the 3 parameters that control our sliders, and I'm going to move those up so that they're actually above our shader folder. And I'm going to set, instead of looking at the parameter tab, on the channels tab we can set default values for the channels. I want a default value of 0 for all 3 of these parameters. If we now click accept, so now we've got defaults of 0. So if we were to squash and stretch, let's stretch it out a bit, bend, and rotate, all easily accessible through the sliders. Once again, if we were to select the move tool, that slider disappears. With our character selected, we simply push enter over the viewport. If you wanted to be able to move and view these sliders at the same time, you can right click on each of these sliders and check persistent, and in doing so, these will maintain even when we grab our move tool, but they'll also maintain even if we select other objects. If you want to remove those, come up to Windows, down to Persistent Handle Editor, delete them out, click accept, they'll disappear. To get them back, select the character, enter over the viewport, and the handles will come back.
Very nice. Very, very nice. And with that, I do believe that's everything that we were looking at doing.
Yeah.
Anything else you can think?
Not for setting up our character, other than I guess we should save him out and match the current definition.
That's a good
Probably
idea.
be cool. So I'm going to right click on our character and come down to save operator type. And I'm going to right click and choose match current definition.
Okay. Let me think. Anything else that we were wanting to do, or is that pretty much everything that...
We could do something, because right now he's not textured in
Yeah.
the viewport, which he's textured at render time, that's fine, but if you're an animator and you're, animating the character, it'd be nice to see what the character's
I
doing,
agree.
where he's facing. This is really easy, and now that we've got our parameter to specify a diffuse map, we can reference this parameter very quickly and basically tell OpenGL, which is the rendering engine used for our viewport, to assign this texture to the diffuse color in OpenGL. I am going to have to allow editing of contents, jump inside. Let's hunt down our shot network, jump inside, hunt down our material, jump inside, and on our VOP surface, we're already presented with some OGL for OpenGL parameters, OGL diffuse, and also OGL texture layers. If we were to add a texture layer, by clicking the plus button next to OGL texture layers, it gives us the ability to specify a texture. Click on the browse. Actually, no. We're going to reference the parameter as opposed to directly linking to that map, because that makes far more sense. So I'm going to use the channel expression that we've all seen. I believe it's actually going to be channel string. And I'm going to jump up a level, up a level, up a level. I think, yeah, so up 3 levels and grab our... What did we call that parameter? Was it... I'm going to do this another way. I'm going to jump up and copy him because I can't remember what we called him. Copy parameter. Jump inside, jump inside. Whoa, one too far. There we go. Find our texture. And I'm going to right click on him and paste copied relative references. There we go. So it's channel string, it was up. Then the map parameter. And then it's in backticks because we need to take the result of this channel string and use that as our texture map. So with that we can now see...
Now show them once again where you went up and copied it from.
Sure, sorry, because I did that kind of quickly. I jumped all the way up till we can see our character asset. I right clicked on the diffuse map, which is a parameter on our asset that was controlling the diffuse map down in our actual shader that's used at render time. I right clicked on that so that I could choose to copy him. With him copied, I jump back inside, back down to where we can see our VOP surface, back down to this texture 1 parameter. I right clicked on texture 1 and I chose paste copied relative references.
Very nice.
It's also worth noting if we were to change the OpenGL diffuse color, we would tint this texture, but I'm very happy just to leave it as a texture, and that means now as we work in the viewport, we can see our texture map.
Very nice.
Cool.
And if up on the digital asset you change out the texture, that will reflect in the viewport as
Exactly.
well.
So now on our digital asset, I'm going to right click, save him out, and right click and match the current definition.
Fantastic. That's everything I was hoping to see completed by the end of the character. And with that, that is going to wrap up this video. Thanks a lot, guys.